Well, thanks so much for joining us today. Mark Ungless is the Director of Data Science, AI, and Research at Mental Health Innovations, a charity improving the mental health of millions in the UK. Mark and I met a few years back when I was at Imperial, and we did some research together on AI for mental health. I just want to start by giving a bit of background about Mark. Mark is a researcher with over 20 years of experience doing research in psychology and neuroscience. He has a PhD in experimental psychology and held academic positions at Imperial College London and the University of Oxford. Ungless was first author on, I'll just talk about a couple of your papers, one breakthrough 2001 study published in Nature showing that even a single exposure to an addictive drug can cause long-lasting changes in the brain's reward circuitry. Mark and his colleagues went on to demonstrate that dopamine neurons are not monolithic. They identified two functionally different dopamine systems, one that encodes rewards and another that encodes aversive or warning signals. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's good.
Beautiful. Yeah. In 2016, Mark published the results of a research collaboration with MIT on social isolation and loneliness neurons, a type of dopamine neuron that, quote, represents the experience of social isolation. So that's a bit about your background. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right, now let's go to the extreme and just have some fun. Are you familiar with the thought experiment of the experience machine?
Not sure.
The experience machine goes down the path of like, imagine a world where we could actually just have some like thing that you put on your brain that gives you full-on experiences, that gives you dopamine in particular. Like, if dopamine is, unexpected rewarding outcomes, you can still cause unexpected rewarding outcomes by simulating it. Usually the question is basically like, would you choose the experience machine? But I'm curious, like, do you think, when you think about, AGI and your predictions for the future, do you think we're going to actually achieve an experience machine?
I mean, I think we're way off from, being properly plugged into the matrix. But
at least a year or two.
Yeah, but I think that again, it's sort of inescapable conclusion that if you take a mechanistic view of the brain and of the world around us, then we should be able to simulate some of these things. And I mean, we have several sensory systems, but we don't have that many. And I mean, we can already, simulate vision pretty well. So
we can.
Now it's a different thing to say whether you could have like something plugged into your optic nerve that would just.
Oh, that's what you mean. You're saying we can simulate vision, as in like we have movies and stuff.
Yeah. Sorry.
And now,
yeah.
can we just convert that into a modality that you plug into your brain rather than putting it in front of your eyes?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I just think in principle that's.
But what I mean is, I guess also just going down the path of dopamine and such. I mean, if I understand correctly, like opioids are just really awesome because they increase dopamine in the brain, right? Or they.
That's one reason why people go off them. Yeah.
Okay. Obviously, you have a far better understanding given this was your research. But there's an argument that people can make, which is basically like opiates just are the experience machine. This is at least like one form of the argument. We have achieved our first step into the experience machine. They're called opiates.
Yeah.
If you take them, then you experience reward without actually having to do anything that's rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that is essentially what those drugs are doing. They are hacking in to the normal, these systems are not there for the pleasure of drugs. They are there for normal operations. But
could you make the same argument about SSRIs? SSRIs are hijacking the parts of your brain.
Yeah, I mean SSRI, and actually the actions of SSRIs, the kind of things they're doing, not unlike what some drugs are doing, like cocaine and amphetamine and so on. So there's no principal difference really between what's happening there. We are hacking the brain.
As a machine learning engineer, I tend to think of all neurons as basically the same. And I guess you've had a lot of your career dedicated to showing that that's not the case in the brain. Well, can I just ask, why are different brain cells different? Like in the context of AI, we think of, neurons interacting with each other just with a weight, like an action potential. And yet, you focus so much on the differences in the cell types. Like, does that matter?
Well, it definitely matters for brain function, I think. And a lot of these kind of motifs that you see in the brain, you see all over nervous systems, all over the animal kingdom. And so some of them are clearly important for regulating neuronal activity, for transmitting signals over long distances across the nervous system, and also for different types of signaling on different temporal scales. So some neurotransmitters signal very, very quickly, and some, like, for example, dopamine, it's much more neuromodulatory, it's much more slower in its impact, but it can be more widespread. And those different temporal characteristics and different wiring characteristics, give great importance sort of functionality to the way the brain works. And it's tempting really to feel like they must be important. There's potential importance for how neural networks operate as well, right?
So you and I have talked a bunch about AGI just for fun. And when I ask, I think you've described yourself as not quite an AGI skeptic, but glass half full. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think, I would say glass half full in the sense that my glass is half full. I mean, AI is performing incredibly well, but doesn't feel to me like AGI is around the corner.
Yeah.
I wouldn't bet. I mean, I wouldn't bet on it happening in my lifetime. But then it depends what you mean by AGI. Of course, all comes down to the definitions. But I think, what you're seeing with AI performance at the moment is incredible performance in some respects, but in other respects, quite unimpressive performance. And, when you look at those issues, it's hard to feel that AGI is about to be upon us.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it's interesting. I'm bringing up the neuroscience thing off the bat just because I think it's been interesting to hear from your perspective about how there is sort of like, when we think about AI neural networks, we kind of miss a dimensionality in the way that human brains work. Is that right? Like when you talk about the way that different neurotransmitters function differently?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think when you look at the complexity of the brain, people often say, there's like 80 billion neurons in the human brain, right? And 80 billion glial cells. And people often just think about that, well, it's like a massive bag of frozen peas, right? All of these neurons are all wedged in together and they're all connecting, each neuron connects with 1,000 other neurons. And there's just this enormous neural network. But when you actually look at the neural circuits, what you realize is that there's this kind of intricate complexity, and a lot of the neural circuits are very different from one another. Like one of the brain regions that's been best studied, the hippocampus, when you actually look at the way those neurons are wired up, and in fact we don't really understand, there's not agreement on all the different types of neurons and all the different ways in which the circuits are organized, but there are all these different parts of the brain and they're organized in quite distinct and quite intricate circuits that we don't really properly understand. And that's very different from just a straightforward neural network, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wanted to jump straight in and talk about the neuroscience side for that reason, which is like, I guess even until looking through your research, it's not obvious to me just how much complexity there is in the human brain. And I think like when you look at, so you told me a little bit about the circuitry. I mean, I was shocked to learn that in terms of the dopamine system, there's like so much that we didn't know. I mean, that I always thought dopamine was like a thing to do with reward. And then I know that, your research was like, hey, it's not just reward. Can you just quickly summarize what that research was?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, that's a really good example because dopamine is probably the neurotransmitter we know the most about in the brain, certainly of all the kind of key neuromodulatory transmitters like serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine. We really know a lot about dopamine, and yet there are these really fundamental questions that are not answered. So there's this old view that dopamine is involved in signaling pleasure and that good things activate the dopamine system, right? And really important breakthrough came from a lot of work by someone called Wolfram Schultz. And what he showed was that dopamine neurons are activated by better than expected events, basically, that they're encoding something called a reward prediction error. So when good things happen or rewarding events, they'll activate dopamine neurons, but only if those events are unexpected, right?
Yeah.
And so that's different from something encoding pleasure. So the question is, why is that important? And of course, this is a classic teaching signal for the brain, right? So when something unexpected happens, that's when you should learn about things, right? So we're all making predictions as we go about the world all day long, trying to maximize our rewards and minimize our punishments. And if we're making correct predictions, we should carry on with our behavior because we're making correct predictions. But if it turns out that those predictions are incorrect, that's when we should stop, pay attention to what caused that unexpected reward or punishment, and learn about it. And so that's dopamine is really providing that teaching signal. So it's really different from it just signaling and causing the experience of pleasure. It's really a teaching signal and a behavior modification signal.
So what's really fascinating to me in particular, talking about dopamine and AIs, are you familiar with the temporal difference, the idea that temporal difference loss is the...
Absolutely. Yeah. So exactly. And so one of the really big insights that Schultz and Peter Diane, who and Reed Montague, who were all talking about this together, was that they realized that dopamine activity looks a lot like a temporal difference algorithm.
Can you just explain are you familiar with the temporal difference algorithm is? Awesome.
Yeah. So, although maybe let's hear your...
Yeah, I mean, the high level is the temporal difference algorithm in the context of reinforcement learning agents. So the example, this was like the time that DeepMind was doing a lot of work on like Atari games. And so the way that they would have an agent play an Atari game is literally like take all the pixels on a screen, pass it into a model, and have it evaluate the value of every possible next state. So if you were to map that forward and look at like the tree of all possible future states, that's like insanely huge. And that was like not feasible. The temporal difference principle was basically the only thing you need to predict is basically what rewards you're going to get in this state transition. So like if I'm Mario and I jump and I get that coin, how is my reward signal going to change? And then what is my expected future reward from that point forward? And if my expectation of what the reward will be differs from what the actual reward looks like, then there's a loss. Then I need to update my model of the world, basically. But it's a model of the world that that encodes specifically expectation of reward and punishment. Did I get that right?
Perfect. I knew you did a better job than me. But that's basically it. And so, dopamine neuron activity follows the same rules. And actually, it's really interesting you mentioned DeepMind because they obviously in the early days, especially, are really inspired by understanding the brain. Demis Hassabis was a neuroscientist, and in fact, he did a lot of work in the same place where Peter Diane was based, who was involved in that original paper about dopamine neurons encoding temporal difference algorithm. So there's clearly like a lot of overlap, which is super interesting. And I mean, that at least encourages you that way of learning, that's the way the human brain, we're learning a lot of stuff like that. That's a good place to start for your AI.
I mean, I feel like there are, skeptic ways you can approach this, but there is at least like this like very simple, basic argument that I think you could make that AI is actually much more similar to brains than we think. And I think the argument is basically, 50 plus years ago, people came up with these ideas for how you could build a very simple model of a human brain into a computer. And the thought would be, hey, if this works, this is going to change everything. This simple model that just, treats a brain in a very simple, low-dimensional way. It ignores a lot of the complexity. All it is like neural connections, basically. If this works, we should be able to do everything with it. And 50 years ago, that was like not true. That like didn't work. 50 years later, we increase our ability to scale compute. We have GPUs. In 2012, we build a much bigger version. You have like AlexNet, which basically follows the exact principles from like 50 years earlier, nothing all that different. And then it just works. So the argument would basically go, we tried to model brains in machines, and then we achieved magic results that look a whole lot like intelligence. Why wouldn't it be like too much of a coincidence to say, oh, no, it actually is nothing like a brain. It just happens to be, we're calling them neural networks. It has nothing to do with the brain, and yet it's still achieving the magical results. Like, I guess I'm wondering the fact that the results are so impressive from neural networks today that are based on the human brain, is that evidence that they actually model how brains work?
I think that's a reasonable suggestion, yeah. I mean, I suppose really the question is, what do you need to do to take those neural networks to get to something like AGI? Mm-hmm. Like, is it clearly they've gone a long way, but is there something else we're going to need? So, I would say that now that's not my speciality, but there was certainly that's an area of debate, right? And like a lot of AI, there's no principled reason to know whether it's a yes or a no, right? So people are just going to have to try. There were a couple of things about current neural network performance which I think are important that are really different from humans. So one is the way in which they learn, right? So humans will learn language very quickly with very limited exposure to data, basically. Clearly, current AI, to reach the level of performance it's getting to, is requiring essentially all data available. Yeah. So that's a really dramatic difference. And the second is that the performance is slightly different. I was thinking about this the other day. You can ask ChatGPT something, it'll give you incredibly fluent answer, very informative and detailed. But then you can also ask it, how many, well, the classic case is like, how many R's are there in strawberry or something.
Yeah.
It probably doesn't do this anymore, but, all the various things that it can get tripped up on that sort of indicate that its understanding of the information is not equivalent.
Different.
And if you were speaking to a human who was being articulate about that information, they would not fall for the same. So it kind of suggests that there's something slightly different.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, okay, so the complete counter argument to the case on like we tried to model brains and we succeeded is we never tried to model brains, and maybe this is all just like an argument by analogy. Maybe like just to go down the other path is basically like, oh, cool, DeepMind claimed that they based stuff on dopamine. Did they? Or did they just later on be like, oh, that's so cool. Dopamine is kind of similar. And actually it was just similar mathematically and in no way similar biologically. Like there is, I guess, the counter argument to be made, which is we've scaled up compute and now we're trying to draw an analogy to brains so we have more justification.
Yeah, so I think, certainly the earliest proponents of neural networks always used to claim that it was inspired by neural networks.
Yes.
And DeepMind came from they all came from a background in neuroscience. Mm-hmm. They'd been exposed to those ideas before they founded DeepMind. So I think some of it could be retrospective storytelling.
It could be,
but I think some of it's about being inspired about, at least the models that are being built are in very fundamental ways kind of inspired by the nervous system, I suppose.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that there still is this analogy. It still looks a little too close to a brain. So I wonder if the other angle to look at this is just in terms of just efficiency, which is like biology evolves, which is a very weird mechanism to like build systems. When we build computers, they don't evolve, we like construct them. Evolved systems tend to be insanely efficient because they can be, like you're dealing with such a low scale. And there's talk right now about like if we could encode data in DNA, then we can encode data like absurdly more efficiently than on a hard drive. Like it would be so much more efficient to just encode like a document, like a .docs file in DNA. If we could do that, obviously that's really hard. So by analogy, there's some argument to be made, hey, neurotransmitters are like a really efficient hack that helps brains operate far more efficiently because, for example, they can operate at different time horizons. Whereas if you didn't have neurotransmitters, you don't have that ability to operate over time horizons built in. So then it becomes sort of this thought of like, what if all biology in the brain outside of the basic neural network are just like incremental efficiency gains, where fundamentally each one of those decreases the amount of data you need to learn that, a cat looks like a cat, or, some sort of task that a human can learn from 3 examples and an AI takes, the internet to learn.
I think it's possible. I suppose we're at the stage now where it's hard to know. The only way we're going to find out is by trying, I think, and people are going to try.
So anyway, back to neuroscience for a minute. I think something that's been really interesting to me when I was looking at your research is it's obviously very different than the constructive generative way that we approach AI, where we're actually trying to like get stuff done. You're focused more on like, can we actually just understand what's happening? Because it is happening every day inside of all of us. We don't need to create it. It's there. And we still have have extremely little understanding of what's going on. So I came across one paper, so one area of your research, hopefully you can comment on, which was around motivation and appetite regulation.
Oh yeah.
Do you remember that work?
Yeah. I think I know which paper you're talking about. Yeah.
I guess I found it fascinating just because it is not as much, I guess, like a systems level, let's understand how dopamine works in the brain, but it's much more specific. If I understood, you'd identified certain systems that were responsible for appetite regulation, and you were able to control in mice appetite regulation by controlling some part of the brain.
Oh yeah, okay, right. So I do remember this one. Yeah, so actually that was a bit of a surprising result, and I'm not sure that we ever quite understood what was happening, but we were really interested originally in salt appetite. Salt appetite is really a really fascinating specific type of appetite that you don't experience strongly all the time, but if you're salt depleted, you'll experience it. And we sort of accidentally, and I mean, it's actually a lot of the discoveries we made one way or another were basically accidents along the way in the lab when we were doing something else. We found that when we stimulated dopamine neurons, this suppressed the appetite. So actually not quite sure why it did. I suppose more broadly, this was part of a kind of larger body of work where we found that different dopamine neurons are involved in different functions. So the account that I gave you of dopamine neurons being activated by reward prediction errors, has been incredibly influential. And a key part of that is that all dopamine neurons are all doing the same thing. They're all broadcasting the same signal to the brain. And yet there were various hints in the literature that some dopamine neurons responding differently to different types of stimuli. And so that's something that I got really interested in quite a long time ago. And we showed that some dopamine neurons are activated by aversive events. So which is not what you would predict based on the reward prediction error theory. Something that's worse than expected should inhibit a dopamine neuron, or they should at least not be responsive to it. But we found that some were excited, and really the real puzzle was that it was only a subset of these dopamine neurons that were responding. So we found that dopamine neurons were not all responding the same way; some were responding differently. And then we went on, and you also mentioned that paper where we showed that some dopamine neurons are really sensitive to social isolation, so they're being activated by this aversive sense of experience of being isolated as well. And so taken together, and I mean other people have also contributed to this idea, we've argued that actually different dopamine systems are involved in different types of behavior. And also some other people have shown, for example, that maybe appetite is more regulated by some dopamine neurons than others. And the idea really is that, well, one possibility is that this, take a step back, when you think about the reward prediction error, right? One important question is what happens when something worse than expected happens, right? So that's clearly a really important signal for the brain as well. Some people say more important than rewards, right? You want to avoid these punishments. And so there must be a neural system that's encoding that. And one possibility is that it's a reduction in dopamine. So you have an increase in dopamine for positive prediction errors.
And a decrease for negative punishment or negative signal.
Exactly. Now, a couple of problems with that hypothesis are that dopamine neurons don't really decrease their firing that much when something unexpectedly bad happens. Right? It's not as strong as the excitations you see. And also, it's kind of hard to imagine how that signaling would be decoded postsynaptically as well. And so
you're saying like how a lack of a neurotransmitter.
Yeah, for postsynaptic receptors, that's harder to say. Oh, sorry. So when all this dopamine is released, right, it then binds to other neurons. And the way it binds to other neurons is it binds to a receptor, which is a specialized protein. It's like the lock and key model. So the dopamine is the key, and it goes into the lock, and then that unlocks processes in the next, or biological processes in the next neuron, right, which could be excitation or activity changes, but could also be like gene expression or other kind of slower changes in
Got
those,
it. So you're saying
cells.
Whatever is kind of happening downstream within the brain because dopamine neurotransmitter was...
Exactly. Yeah. And the way to think about dopamine neurons is that they have these incredibly broad, they probably have the most complex projections of any neuron in the animal kingdom. They make millions of synaptic connections. Most neurons are connecting with maybe 1,000 other neurons. Dopamine neurons are making, in the human brain, making maybe millions of synaptic connections. So and
they're spreading widely across the brain, like
exactly.
you were saying,
they're going
acting as like one system.
Exactly. So they're going all the way into your limbic system and up into your cortex. From this tiny nucleus, in the midbrain, maybe you have a couple of 100,000 of these neurons, not very many of the 80 billion you've got. But they send this incredibly dense arborization, right? And they're like little trees. Well, most neurons are like trees in some way. And they just have this very, very complex route of branches or axonal projections. Where
so understanding what you were saying, when something worse happens than what you were expecting, it should probably cause some wide-ranging impact where you're like, whatever I just did, don't do that again.
Exactly.
But it would be hard to explain that through just a lack of dopamine. It would make much more sense that something actually is.
Exactly. It would be another neurotransmitter system, for example, right? So one idea people have suggested is that serotonin might do that, but actually that's been really hard to demonstrate. We did a bit of research on that. It's been really hard to, for various reasons that probably then might get a bit too technical for this discussion. But
you did mention to me in the past that serotonin is just very hard to study as well.
Yeah, exactly. Some of them are just technical limitations, and dopamine neurons happen to be amenable to. They're actually pretty tricky to study as well, but maybe not as hard as serotonin neurons. But one other possibility is, well, maybe there were just different types of dopamine neuron, right? So one type of dopamine neuron does your positive prediction errors, and another type of dopamine neuron does your negative prediction errors, right? And so this is what we argued, and actually some other people argue that at a similar sort of time. And the debate still continues unresolved, which I think sort of goes to show how, these things move slowly, but they move slowly as well because it's technically really challenging, really challenging work to resolve. So even fundamental questions like that are like, still largely, still up for debate in one of the neurotransmitter systems that's the best understood in the brain.
So from the outside, as a layperson, when I hear that, it's really hard to study this area, but we've had a bunch of unexpected results where we can identify, systems of the brain that are responsible for loneliness or that affect loneliness, and we have systems of the brain that affect, the wanting of salt, and you can actually increase people's desire or an animal's desire for salt and, increase and decrease it. I have to wonder, without necessarily understanding every part of the brain, you have to imagine that this project of neuroscience continues, and over time we become better and better aware of specific parts of the brain responsible for different things. And part of how you're studying this, at least for some of these systems, is that you're actually able to induce a state by modifying the way that neurons fire. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So where does that lead you philosophically?
Where does that lead you philosophically? Well, I mean, you're right that the field keeps moving forward, and people are making incredible discoveries all the time. And at some point, we'll have agreement on what are all the different parts of the nervous system, and then some point after that, we'll start to have agreement about all the different functions of the nervous system, and then we'll start to really understand how the mind works. And I suppose philosophically, then really this leads up to having a much better mechanistic understanding of behavior and psychology. And then I think the big questions that people always talk about are, okay, well, how does this then relate to consciousness? How does this relate to sense of free will?
Yes, that's where I was going with this.
Yeah.
So I recently read this book, Determined, by Robert Sapolsky, who's a Stanford professor, a neuroscientist, and an anthropologist. He does a lot, it seems. And in the book, he basically makes the case that in neuroscience, there's a lot we don't understand, but we keep understanding more and more. And whenever we look for an explanation, we tend to find one. We don't tend to have this sense of like there are uncaused, behaviors. So I guess part of what I wonder is, you work in the mental health space these days, which we should, we'll get back to. But I guess, does it change the way that you interact with people or the way that you would think about people making decisions when you think, hey, this person made this decision because they really wanted salty food, but actually I could have, modified this one little part of their brain and suddenly they wouldn't have wanted that salty food anymore. Like, does it make people seem less like full selves that make decisions when you know that actually you could just break them down into a brain and think of different regions of the brain, acting semi-independently to make decisions?
Yeah. So I look at everyone like little complicated little machines. I mean, it's interesting. It's probably something which probably the same for all neuroscientists and lots of biologists, is that, we take a bit more for granted than maybe lots of other people do. That when I think about, I don't understand why someone behaves in a certain way, or I don't understand, or just generally a certain type of behavior. But to me, it seems like a tractable problem, right? It's just, if we study it enough, we will understand it, right? And it won't turn out, there's no mystery. There's no magic going on. Well, it's magic. It's amazing, but it's not magic.
That's so fascinating. So when you do think about this, when you're like, I cannot understand why this person is doing this behavior, it's so, annoying, or this person's so brilliant, I can't understand how they achieve that brilliance. And you're like, I can't yet understand, but I'm sure that we can understand it if we just work a little harder.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. I mean, I'm super, optimistic about science. I mean, I just think that science is incredible, really, and like you say, when we apply ourselves to it, we basically make progress towards understanding things. It's the best way to find things out, and it's been incredibly effective. And I just believe that we will just continue to do that. Now, it's certainly, some people might argue, oh, well, maybe understanding the brain will be, at some point, we'll just run up against something that's beyond our ability, and philosophically, maybe it's not possible for the brain in some way to understand the brain. the ideas are too, it's too complex, and we can't do it. We might have to wait for AI to solve that.
There's something weird here about like, though, even if we fail to understand it, once you've gone down a path of repeatedly trying to understand something and then succeeding, there has to be some feeling of like, it doesn't really matter if I successfully understand this particular behavior. There is obviously a mechanism, and I know that more than most people because I've seen mechanisms for other behavior.
Yeah, so I mean, it's true that you don't have, I suppose what you're saying is that you don't have to understand. It depends really what your aim is. So I think, science as a whole is, even though it's a sense of moving towards understanding everything, it's always aimed at understanding something specific. And there are certain things which, just are never understood for some one reason or another because don't seem important. They're not prioritized.
Yeah.
And so it could end up being the same with either the anatomy of the brain or, there are all sorts of weird and wonderful possibilities. Maybe it turns out that like having this parts list, this like something that the neuroscience community is like sunk, untold millions into and always claims is vital, which is to have like a parts list of the brain, maybe we'll look back on that and realize that actually that was a fool's errand because for the, some of the reasons that you're talking about, right? It's a neural network, and that's the most important thing.
Yeah, there's something here. I think one idea I've heard that, the paper, the magical number 7 plus or minus 2, that basically just people can't keep in mind more than 7 things at once, whatever a thing is. A thing could be like a digit or a thing could be like an object or an idea, plus or minus 2. And so there's something here as it applies to science, which is like scientific theories can be incredibly complex, but they have to be composed of incremental bricks. You can't have more than like around 7 bricks in an idea. This is basically the framing. That if I were to explain a region of the brain and I were to define that region of the brain, I can use something like 7 separators to be like, this is what I mean by the region of the brain. But if I go beyond that, everyone's just confused and lost. And that becomes some sort of intrinsic limitation where if you could imagine a neural net that was studying a neural net, if you're imagining, non-human, that can construct ideas that are composed of 1,000 parts, perhaps they're like, it's very simple. This part of the brain is defined by, and then you have some extremely complex relationship-oriented idea with differential equations or something that like we just could not conceive of. But it has extreme predictive power.
Yeah.
I guess you end up, like one of the questions that, when you're talking about science, you were saying, a limitation of science is there are a lot of things not worthwhile to study, and so we just don't study it, and therefore we don't learn. Doesn't mean that we couldn't, it just means it's not worth our time. And a lot of that could change if we had, massively more resources from AI, where we could end up in a world of, the goal is just to be able to predict behavior, and otherwise we don't really care about the mechanisms, and we don't care about what's going on inside, but we care about predicting behavior. And then perhaps, on the path to predicting behavior, it becomes necessary to have an extremely strong mechanistic understanding of just everything in the brain.
Yeah, it's possible it could become trivially easy to solve, to have a wiring diagram for every human brain or something, and so then it would just be done because it would be trivially easy. I still think in that kind of world that feels not resource constrained, there'll still be resource constraints, and so it'll always be a question: is it worth doing or not? But it might become so cheap and easy that people do it.
Yeah. Here's a question, changing topics a bit. How did you get into the mental health space?
So, actually, I did a psychology degree, and I originally thought I might be a clinical psychologist. And I did a bit of work experience at a psychiatric hospital one summer. And it had all of the, it has a sort of long stay patients who are in there. They're really chronic psychiatric disorders. And I can remember after that thinking, some of those disorders are so interesting, but so intractable and hard to treat. And I can remember thinking, maybe I'd be more interested in going into research. It really felt like, and it was quite a long time ago, and maybe the really research needed to be done really to understand psychology in the brain, before it was going to be straightforward to help these people. So anyway, then I got interested in research. I had some really great lecturers actually who really inspired me, and the whole thing of doing science really excited me. So I went into research. But then after I'd been doing that for quite a while, I began to get a bit, I mean, I don't know if bored is quite the right word, but I'd been doing it for quite a long time, and I had my own research group, and I'd done all the things that I sounded really amazing when I was a bit younger, like publishing interesting papers and having PhD students and winning grants and things like that. And I could tell that I was getting a little stale. I thought to myself, I think this is an opportunity to make a change. And so I basically closed down my lab and then started looking around for opportunities in kind of mental health tech and neurotech. And so that's how I ended up at Mental Health Innovations.
So it's really more of a, start out in psychology and you're like, am I really going to be able to help these people? Maybe we actually need to get a little bit more researchy, go down more of an understanding route. And if we can gain more of a mechanistic understanding of these disorders through neuroscience or psychology, who cares? They're, related.
Yeah, I think that was broadly the idea. I'm not sure. I mean, society has made a bit of progress in treating mental health. It's made a lot of progress in destigmatizing it and having discussions about it and thinking about it, which I think has been really important.
So I'm curious to ask you on that in particular. Yeah. So can we talk about the serotonin theory of depression?
Sure.
I ask this because I think it ties in a lot of the topics that we're talking about. Yeah. And, it's something that we've spoke about briefly. So there was a paper in 2023, big impactful one. I did look it up. The Serotonin Theory of Depression, a systematic umbrella review of the evidence. In the abstract, they write, the main areas of serotonin research provide no consistent evidence of there being an association between serotonin and depression, and no support for the hypothesis that depression is caused by lower serotonin activity or concentrations. And I guess the context worthwhile to give when speaking about this is there is a common understanding in society that we have these drugs called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors that people take. And I think the very common layman explanation that many people would believe is depression is a disease where people don't have enough serotonin in their brain, and it can be treated pretty easily by increasing the amount of serotonin in their brain through these pills called SSRIs. Of course, there's been this big backlash, hence this review, to say that's too simple, that's not true. I know that you have a lot of thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really interesting debate where to start on it. I think that the key thing about that review paper, from my point of view, is that what it shows is that the evidence directly showing that a reduction of low levels of serotonin leading to depression is weak. The evidence is weak. And I think some people disagree with that. I know a lot of people who are working in the field think that the evidence is actually a bit stronger. But it's certainly not. I would say it's not super strong.
Let me just ask at a higher level: is depression a brain disease?
Well, so it's clearly something to do with the brain, right? So I think that's the important thing. So it must be in some way to do with the way your brain is functioning. Unless you're a dualist. So, I mean,
so you're saying unless it's your soul or it's, in your feet or something like that, it seems to probably be in your brain.
Unless your mind is some non-physical thing floating above your head.
Whatever it is obviously in your head.
Something to do with your brain, right? So, and so it's fair to say, if you don't want to be depressed, that it's something to do with your brain not functioning correctly, right? So dysfunction of the brain. I think that we all agree on that. Now, whether it's useful to use a word like disease, I think is less clear to me. So there are lots of things that are diseases where you either have the disease or you don't. And it's useful to talk about it like that. But I think for mental health, it's not always helpful because most psychological traits are continua where you have various traits that sit on that, so for example, mood, you can be either very, very happy or very, very sad, and we all sit somewhere along that and we can move along it. And if you're very, very sad at the very far end, you'll be clinically depressed. And so, okay, I mean, this raises so many topics, so I try not to lose my thread, but of course, that raises the topic of, well, how do you even diagnose someone? Mm-hmm. Right? So you can, in the end, you have to come up with sort of relatively arbitrary cutoffs for saying someone is or is not clinically depressed, right? So psychiatrists have a whole, there's a massive diagnostic manual. That's the first sign that there's a problem. The diagnostic manual is so big that it's, And
I would also add, like, I think my understanding of the evolution of the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual used to diagnose
yeah,
disorders, in particular with depression and anxiety, has struggled incredibly with like inter-annotator agreement, which is to say, here's a case file from a person. Do they have depression? Yes or no? It is incredibly hard to just get two people to agree on that, even with the book. And the kind of idea with evolving, with changing those thresholds has been, let's just get more people to agree. Because even if we're wrong sometimes, if we can agree, then at least we could do research on the same population and we can use the same terminology and we can figure out what actually helps people.
exactly. And what would be even better is if we had proper biological diagnostic tools, right?
Like an MRI.
An MRI or some kind of blood test or anything that was replicable and completely objective.
Yeah.
And at the moment, we don't really have that. And so that creates a number of problems.
Why don't we have that?
Not enough more research is needed. One reason we don't have that, it may be because a lot of these disorders, it's not like you either have it or you don't. We're sitting on continuous. So there will always be an arbitrary cutoff.
Yeah. I mean, just
even,
high blood pressure, has a cutoff, and blood pressure is a continuum, but obviously we do have a test for it.
Exactly. So some of these disorders have some progress. I mean, I go back to dopamine again because it's the best understood. So, and actually some of this relates, I think, to the serotonin hypothesis, which is that, one of the first antipsychotics for treating psychotic episodes with people who have schizophrenia was dopamine receptor antagonists. So they're the drugs that block the actions of dopamine. And because of that, people are like, must be too much dopamine in the brain of people who are having a psychotic episode. And if you block the actions, you reduce the psychotic episode. So actually, after many, many years, it turns out that is actually looks like that's correct. So when you do imaging studies of dopamine in the brain, people who are having psychotic episode or even just pre-psychotic episode have elevated dopaminergic activity in the brain. So that hypothesis turns out to have some truth to it.
So luckily in that case, it is at least relatively simple. There is some way that you can actually draw a cutoff by just looking at dopamine activity.
Even though psychosis is a super complex event, and actually it's kind of interesting to think, maybe we can come back to how just having too much dopamine might make you psychotic. But anyway, and there are probably other things happening in the brain as well. But you can imagine then on the back of that if serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors increase serotonin in the brain, and that improves mood. Well, the SSRIs do increase serotonin. Mm-hmm. So they definitely increase serotonin, and they certainly, for some people, improve their mood. Mm-hmm. And so then you might say, well, it's not unreasonable to think that there's not enough there's depleted serotonin in the brain of some of these people. But demonstrating it's been really difficult. Just imaging serotonin in the human brain is incredibly difficult. And it's very high. The temporal resolution is really low. The spatial resolution is really low, so you can't detect changes over more than maybe seconds, more like minutes. You can only see very big areas of the brain. The resolution is not down to like little microcircuits and so on. So it's just a really, really hard thing to do. And so on that basis, if I would be very cautious about saying that it's been shown that it's not the case. Mm-hmm. So, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Yeah, and the wording in the paper is very particular in how they word this.
Yeah. So I think also given we don't have a full understanding of serotonin, but given what we know about serotonin and the circuits involved in, I'd be quite surprised if it wasn't involved in mood in some way. But anyway, sorry, I'm digressing a bit. You asked about disease. So then the question is it useful to refer to depression as a brain disease? Well, it's clearly something to do with the brain. A disease or not, some people find that useful, right? And I think it's because people who are depressed, they find that helpful because they feel like it acknowledges the gravity of their issues.
Yeah. And I think there's some element of it's not my fault. Johann Hari writes about in Lost Connections a lot about his experience with depression. And he talks about how much of a relief it was to find out, it's just a brain disease. And if I take some pills, I'll be okay. And then he also talks about how disappointed he was when he had to increase those dosages over time and learned that he was not cured by simply that it wasn't a black and white, here's the pill that cures you.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a double-edged sword, and I think also it's a relief for that responsibility to be taken away from people. I can see that, but also then that can discourage people from exhibiting like agency over their own life, right?
Yeah.
So with a lot of mental illness and also lots of other disorders, feeling like you have some control to manage whatever's happening to your health, that you can take steps to improve your health, is really, really important. And by taking a view that you have a disease and that you are passively experiencing this disease, may not help you get better as well. So I think that's, it's nuanced.
It's an interesting phrasing you said there, passively experiencing this disease.
Yeah.
I'm just noting the phrasing, because I guess part of what's interesting when you're looking, I know you've talked a little bit about like right now your work is not in trying to diagnose and treat depression and to give people drugs. So presumably, if you're telling me that, there is a major problem, which is depression, it's also on a spectrum, it is a scale, it's not black and white. It seemingly has something to do with serotonin, and SSRIs are effective. I mean, why are you not working on just giving SSRIs to everyone?
Well, so SSRIs don't work for everyone. I think that it's a really crude drug as well. So we talked about, the science of investigating increases in serotonin is very crude. Taking an SSRI is a very, very crude drug to take. It's elevating serotonin in all sorts of parts of your brain. And so it might be it's helpful for some people, but I think that, the way to think about shifting people along these psychological traits is there are lots of different ways you can move along the psychological traits. So you can take some drugs. It'll move you. May move you, some people. But clearly there are other ways of doing it. So you can have talking therapy, cognitive behavioral therapies, maybe even things like going for a walk in nature. There is like a whole, library of possible interventions that you can do, and they may work for some people in better than others in different ways that we don't really understand.
So when you're thinking about this as a psychologist and a neuroscientist, you have to realize, of course, that like neuroscience has learned more about the brain and has introduced ideas like the serotonin theory, and that leads to a shift in a mentality that it's more of a brain disease, and we err towards thinking that drugs are a good idea. I tend to completely understand that point of view, because there does have to be some feeling of like, if it's in the brain, if we can identify regions, shouldn't we be able to target those regions with drugs? Why should we have to target them with actions? I'm just curious how this affects you.
Oh, well, I mean, it depends what those changes are, right?
Yeah.
So if you understand those changes, then you can think about the best way of modifying them, essentially, right? And based on what we know about the brain currently, a lot of these issues are probably to do with neural circuitry that's not operating the way it wants to be operating, synaptic connections being stronger or weaker. Now, changing that connectivity, influencing the activity of those circuits, just a drug may not be the best way to do it. It may be, and when I think about therapy, for me, therapy is a way of changing neural circuits.
Interesting. Say more.
So, when you experience therapy, if you change, that must be because something changed in your brain.
Because for you to change is for your brain to change.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and so, and what changed? Well, in all likelihood, it will be the way neural synaptic connection. It will be changes at synaptic connections. So the way neurons are connected to each other and the way those circuits are operating. So at one level of explanation, even though one level of explanation may be a psychological one, right? I feel better because I talked about this thing that was troubling me, and now I don't feel so bad. That is a result of changes in neural circuits and neural connectivity. Yeah. And
which ideally, if we had measurement tools for this, we'd be able to measure it and say, your drugs are working very well. And in this case, we're talking about therapy.
That's it. And I think the next step probably for the area, and it's kind of thing that people are thinking about, is that you might not have a drug on its own. It might be therapy and a drug. It might be you can imagine a scenario where maybe changing those neural circuits is facilitated by a drug.
Right? Like psychedelic therapy.
Possibly, yeah, exactly. It's sort of opening your mind, right? Maybe people talk about, psychedelics because it like opens your mind, but maybe what psychedelics do is, facilitate neuroplasticity, and so then you have therapy,
which might be the same thing.
and it's just different ways of talking about the same thing. Exactly.
Yeah,
So
I'm also just thinking back to the, desire for salty foods idea of like, if you want to change a mouse's desire for salty foods, you might be able to, shock their brain in the right place. You also can give them salt and then they'll usually want less,
yeah,
like
yeah,
there are, because from that kind of point of view, this is true of, if you're hungry, you could potentially shock part of your brain to not be hungry. But there are a lot of other things you can also do to not be hungry, like to eat food, because that is how the brain works. Loneliness was the other one I was thinking about there, because it would seem very suspicious to say we can cure loneliness with a drug. That would be if we're talking about, depression here, I mean, I can't imagine we probably will have a point where people will try to treat loneliness with a drug. And that's going to be really weird.
yeah. So I think that would be surprising, but it could be that.
I would bet this is going to happen at some point. They're going to be like, are you lonely? Don't want to be lonely, but also don't want to talk to people? Although it would make more sense to not say cure loneliness. Then it would be like reduce your, desire for social interaction.
Yeah, exactly.
And then when you look at it that way, you're suddenly like, oh, I don't want to reduce my desire for social connection. I just want to be less lonely. All right, maybe you should go to therapy.
I think it's, possible that, yeah, it's not implausible that we get better understanding of those neural circuits about social interaction. And there might not be a single drug that does it. But again, in principle, these are all mechanisms that are in the brain. And if we can understand how they work, then we should be able to modify them.
Yeah. And then if we step aside from like the super biological side where you're taking pills, it's, it's no secret you're director of AI at Mental Health Innovations. I believe it's no secret that you guys do AI research and you're looking into the applications of AI for mental health. And are we allowed to talk about the work that we do together?
Sure. Yeah, we definitely should. Yeah.
All right, cool. But yeah, so we work together on some work on training AI to help people with their mental health, something analogous to therapy. I don't know what we're allowed to call it out loud, but it's kind of AI therapy.
Yeah, AI support.
AI support.
Mental health support.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know how much I have to be politically correct, but you're welcome to use the correct terms. But no, I mean, I guess I wonder is on this spectrum when we're talking about helping people, you have to imagine that AI support is a lot less intrusive than drugs, right? Like, can you talk a little bit just quickly about the service that MHI provides through Shout?
Yeah, sure. So Mental Health Innovations is a charity that is developing new digital products and services to support people's mental health in the UK. So our first service is Shout, which is a 24/7 text-based service to support anyone in the UK. And also actually recently we merged with The Mix, which is another digital charity that run a number of online services. So we're really committed to providing digital solutions to support people and support their mental health. So Shout it's turned out to be really popular. We had a public launch in 2019, and we've since held more than 3 million conversations with almost 1 million people in the UK on that service. And it's primarily a listening service. So people text in, they get connected with a trained volunteer who's supervised by one of our clinical staff, and they can have a conversation about whatever's on their minds. We get a range of things that people are talking to us about. Quite a lot of people coming, the most common issue that people talk to us about is suicide or self-harm. People are also coming to us with anxiety, low moods, worries about school, bullying, this kind of thing. And so it's turned out to be incredibly popular. That's generated a lot of data, and we're really committed to using that data to further, to optimize the way we run the service and to generate insights into mental health that we think are of interest to others in the UK.
And so some time ago, I guess we started with training volunteers and if you want to, feel free to.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things we found out really early on was that there were lots of people who wanted to volunteer for us. We've trained, I think, almost 20,000 people. But they very often struggled with confidence. It's really difficult. You do online training, but then you don't get much opportunity to practice. And then you're immediately on the platform and you're having to have a text conversation with someone in the middle of the night who's really in a difficult spot. And so people wanted more practice. And so, early on, we started talking about, would it be possible to build a chatbot? And, this is pre-chat GPT, but, it still seemed like an exciting possibility. And And of course, when you did that project with us with Imperial, so we have this partnership with Imperial College, it's been really great. And I think one of the things that became clear from that project as a sort of side finding was that
we can actually simulate
probably
these conversations and actually train a language model.
Probably the tech had got to a point where it was reasonable to do that.
And then a couple of years ago, well, I guess that was some time ago, and the tech was pretty early. We did build out our experiments, and then I guess when Slingshot became a thing, it was a natural progression to say, let's fine tune a version of this model that we can actually, to start with, that can simulate the kinds of people who use Shout so that we can understand what conversations with those kinds of users would look like and use that for training. And now, of course, we've also trained a model that can actually simulate the volunteer side of the conversation and can actually give suggestions in Copilot, suggestions on what to say, especially in the hardest parts of the conversations. How do you start a conversation, wrap it up, go through, the suicide risk assessment processes like that. Nothing launched yet, but I guess one thing that we have talked about is some people who reach out to Shout are obviously doing so because they want to talk to a person. But I think we have a pretty strong idea that that's not everyone, and that there are probably a lot of people who, given the choice between a human and AI, would choose an AI.
Definitely the case, yeah. I mean, I think, a lot of people are using Shout because they want to text and they don't want to speak as well. They want to talk to someone they don't know, and they don't want to be judged. And I think that a lot of these reasons and others mean that people are amenable to talking to an AI. And there's good research. Well, good research. There's some research to suggest that that's the case. That some people, under some circumstances, would choose to talk to an AI. So, I mean, I'll give you an interesting example from us. I mean, it's clear that people are using ChatGPT and all sorts of other platforms to talk about their mental health. We know you can
character AIs.
Yeah, you can
psychotherapist.
Read about it in the papers all the time.
Yeah.
When Snapchat released My AI, I think it was 2 years ago now. We were incredibly busy for a couple of days and we weren't sure why. And we realized it's because we were people were being signposted to us from Snapchat's My AI. And so people were using this service had been launched. It's not a mental health service. Definitely Snapchat, definitely don't want people using it to discuss their mental health. But people were going on there talking about their mental health and then being signposted to us.
Yeah. And we were hearing this a ton from My AI. Part of their struggle was, they were like, hey, how do we actually handle the fact that a ton of people just want to talk to us about their mental health? Exactly.
So, so this just goes to show that people really want, and it's because they don't have anyone to talk to. Most of the people who contact Shout say that they contact us because they don't have anyone to talk to. Mm-hmm. Either because it's late at night, or even if it's during the day, they don't have anyone to talk to, and so they really just want to be listened to. And I think that a lot of people recognise that even if it's an AI, there's still some usefulness in expressing yourself. Yeah. And there were all, we can think about, there are all sorts of benefits you can think about to talking even to an AI that maybe doesn't do much but listen to you really and sort of reflect back.
But
exactly.
I guess one thing here is Shout is increasing accessibility of just like a listening service to a much larger population. But even then, by far the biggest limitation in the Shout service is just you don't have an infinite number of people that can provide the service. And so you mentioned, I think you said 3 million conversations with 1 million people. That's not that many conversations per person. You're pretty significantly having to limit the number of conversations a person can have.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge for us has been that the demand for the service is hard for us to meet. And so, some, especially late at night, that people sometimes have to wait to get through. And that's not unique to us. And there were very lengthy queues for NHS mental health services. Or any mental health service provider will tell you that they're really overwhelmed with demand, and that's because there's been such an explosion really in it's a bit dramatic word to use. There's been a very, very strong increase in number of people who are seeking out support for their mental health, and there just aren't enough people to provide that. And so, if there's a technical solution to that, if there's AI service that can help in some cases that some people want, then we really need to. This is not one of those things where it's about replacing the humans.
Yeah.
There just aren't enough humans.
Yeah.
And so we really, society really needs to think seriously about that.
And I think also we've talked a lot about the lower end of the acuity spectrum in terms of this can be a stepping stone towards accessing human care, but it's always going to be a really long time before you're going to get that human care being realistic. And if there are people that we can offload from that system, that we can say, we can actually make room for the people who really need access to those human services.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think sometimes people talk about these apps as being like digital doorways or digital stepping stones towards getting treatment. So you need to look at it in the whole, really, as what's available to everyone, and that it could be useful to discuss what's on your mind with a bot before you then go and see your therapist, or it could be useful for you to have that conversation in between therapy sessions, or there's any number of possibilities. Or it could be that you have a brief conversation in a digital app, and actually that makes you feel a bit better.
Yeah.
You decide you don't need to go and see someone.
I was going to say on that last point, given that when we first got started with our research years back, language models were like barely a thing. We were dealing with BERT models, non-generative LLMs, but still, large scale pre-trained. And of course, the world has changed, and I think we reached, or at least, I reached a point where I thought, like, finally, I think models can do this. And I came to you and I'm like, hey, let's just do this because I think it is possible now. It might actually be possible now. And we can see where the technology is at. I mean, how far off do you actually think we are from being able to beat the median therapist in terms of having, efficacious conversations?
So my cup's definitely more than half full on this.
More than half full.
Yeah. I think already the generative AI apps they're so engaging. I mean, that's really the key thing.
Mm-hmm.
There are other apps that don't use generative AI, and the limitation is that they're just not as engaging. And maybe if you stick with them and you follow their structured program, and you can have, but people have benefit from them. But that is the key thing with generative AI, is it's so engaging.
Yeah.
And I feel like for a lot of people, we're not far off having performance that'd be good enough to help them. A lot of people. It's like, for example, a lot of people contacting Shout. They only contact us once or twice. They're in a tight spot, and they maybe a moment of crisis, and they want to talk about it, and they want to think about what they're going to do next. We're just listening and helping them work through what they might do at the end of the conversation. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something which AI could do now pretty well. Obviously there's the issue. There is this issue around quality. Can it do it well enough? The main concern that people have is around safety. Mm-hmm. That's a challenge, but not an insurmountable challenge in my view.
And I guess we are talking. Well, I'm excited for the future of our partnership then, because I guess the next big thing we're working on is just demonstrating safety of our system. So
yeah, and I think that's going to be really important for people to, there's not much discussion about that now. It's just the moment. I think I read an article yesterday actually about someone whose chatbot encouraged them to kill themselves or something. We're still at the stage where people are trying to jailbreak systems to do that, but I'm sure that we'll move beyond that. And I mean, also the other thing is sort of unpopular amongst certain people, but humans aren't perfect. I think there's a real possibility that AI or AI supporting humans is going to increase outcomes for people. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. A lot of people are just like, oh, we've got humans over here and we've got the AI over here, and the AI, we're trying to get the AI to be as good as the humans, but really what we're trying to do is improve outcomes as well as have good outcomes for more people. And I really think that AI is going to help with that.
Increasing, partially because we can just reach more people, and partially because the bar might not be as high as we think.
Yeah, or even if it's high, it could be higher.
Yeah. Yes. And I think what's also been really interesting about your work is in the mental health space, virtually nothing is ever researchable, like because sessions are not recorded, you don't have transcripts. And I guess with your service, you actually have transcripts at scale that allow you to understand what works mechanistically, like which conversations work, what comments can a volunteer say that have an impact. So it'll be really
Yeah.
interesting, I think, entering the AI age when we can finally study the mechanisms of what works and then also iterate incrementally at scale, instead of having a lot of different people and trying to develop institutional knowledge, teach each other. Suddenly you're actually able to improve online by just seeing what works.
Yeah, so that's definitely a big opportunity. And I mean, the whole area of mental health is data poor in many ways. It's hard to do research. Even we're talking about diagnostic criteria, but also when you look at outcomes criteria, right? These are basically questionnaires, about how you're feeling and how you've been feeling recently. And it would be good to have better way of testing, whether someone really is really has improved.
Even if it were just a matter of taking the same kinds of research and just making it a little bit more objective, taking, have a conversation and have the transcript lead to a diagnosis rather than have the doctor decide on a diagnosis.
Exactly, could be. Yeah, you could imagine that would be the case. That would be really useful, and it might not be an either or as well. It's all about enhancing, all the information that we're getting. I think there's a real opportunity there.
Last thing to bring up, and a completely unrelated topic, is we've talked a lot about stoicism, and I think you've learned a lot from, you've learned a lot from being a psychologist, I guess, and from the space you've been in, working in mental health, about the kind of best practices that work for you. Obviously, we are speaking from a scientific perspective, where we'd much rather have a lot of different approaches and not, just go based on intuitions. But can you share a little bit about your theory of the good life?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's become quite popular, Stoicism, recently, and I'm kind of glad. And I think it's become popular because there's a few, good communicators who've been promoting it. Like most philosophy, it's not super accessible if you read the original sources.
Yeah.
But people like Ryan Halliday, I think have done a really good job of communicating that to people. So I read a book. And David Goggins, he's one of my favorites, if you want an entertaining read. So a really great book that I read is called The Stoic Guide to the Good Life by William Irvin, who's a philosopher in the States. And he, I think, does the best job of providing food for thought. So for me, what I really like about Stoicism is that it provides ways of thinking that I think are really useful in life. And I think particularly, relevant also to sort of mental health, really, because I think, the challenge is to lead a productive, everyone wants to be happy and to be content, but it's hard to be productive and ambitious and competitive and be happy and content.
So the challenge is, how do you balance, like, be ambitious, try to change the world, don't be completely still and just let the world pass you by, but at the same time, be happy.
Yeah, exactly.
And those two are competing. And I guess, do you want to just summarize? I know you gave me a very simple summary.
Yeah. So I think for me, the key things are, the first thing is really trying to recognize what you can and can't control in the world. Mm-hmm. So, this is really important for Stoicism, is that there's no point raging against something that you can't control. Mm-hmm. And when something happens to you, what you really need to try and do is identify what parts of it you can control, and then that's where you should act. Mm-hmm. So it's not always completely clear, but it's a really, really useful framework for thinking about that. I think the second part to that that's really important is that it's not even always clear. You can what you have is within your gift to control how you feel about something to a certain degree, or to, it's not always easy to control how you feel, but in the end, that is, you can't control if something happens to you, but at least you have some potential to control how you feel about something. And also to think about whether something really is good or bad. Things are not always intrinsically good or bad, and so how you feel about them is somewhat in your control, and that's really important. And
so just to summarize that, it was first, in a situation, you have to think, what can I control and what can't I control? Don't get too upset about the things you can't control. Focus on what you can control. And second, you do have some control on how external stimuli make you feel. And you should use that.
Yeah, exactly, and it's really important because things aren't always straightforward. So there's this story, the fable of the Chinese farmer and the horses. So super short version is that he's out one day and all these horses arrive on his farm, and all the local villagers gather around and say, "Oh, it's really wonderful. You've got all these horses. You're so lucky." And he says, "Well, we'll see." And then the next day, his son is out corralling the horses and trying to break one of them in, and he gets thrown off the horse and breaks his leg. And all the villagers gather around and say, "Oh, this is so terrible. Your only son has broken his leg." And the farmer says, we'll see." And then the next day, war breaks out, and the military come and gather up all the young men, take them off to the war. But they don't take the farmer's son because his leg is broken. And so then villagers are like, "Oh, that's such good luck." And then the farmer's like, "Well, we'll see." And so, it's just a really important illustration of how you don't always know how things are going to unfold. And so it's important to kind of keep that in mind, I think. And the other lesson from that William Irvine gives, which I really like, is to view a lot of life as like playing a game of tennis, and that really the way to think about playing a good game of tennis is to play your best game. It's not to aim to win. Right, and so the analogy that he gives is if you're playing a game of tennis against, say, Roger Federer, right, you are obviously going to lose, and you shouldn't. It doesn't make any sense to get upset about that. But what you should try and do is play your best game of tennis against Roger Federer, right? And you're going to feel most content and satisfied if you play your best game. And of course, the truth is that if you play your best game, you're actually most likely to win. And so in lots of situations in life, we should be trying to play but it's about, again, you can control yourself and how you play the game, but you can't always control who you're playing against, and you can't always control the outcomes. But if you focus on playing your best game, then you are also most likely to win.
I love this. We started talking about dopamine and serotonin and the mechanisms, and we end with the advice from the neuroscientist, which is stoicism is a great way to rewire your brain.
Exactly.
That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay. Pleasure. Thank you. Enjoyed that.